Ligatures are symbols for combinations of two or more notes. They are used abundantly in the 13th century, but in later times they lose their importance. The 16th century only shows the less complicated ligatures, and around 1600, actually the only survived ligature is the kop. Here we see an example of the Ivrea Codex, a beautiful codex of the 14th century with a lot of music of Guillaume de Machaut. And we see here the tenor part, and that's almost only ligatures. And here, around 1430, the book we already know, the Book of Ox. And especially in the older compositions, ligatures are used very often. And here is an example of the second half of the 15th century, the choir book of the Burgundian Court Chapel. Still a lot of ligatures. And finally, after 1500, this is the Occo Codex, one of the Alamire manuscripts. In many compositions, you will find no ligatures at all anymore. This is a nice example where there are still, we see the use of them, but it's not that often anymore. The note values that are used are maxima, longa, brevis and semibrevis. And the semibrevis is only used in the ligatura kop. The longa and the brevis are used very often, the most common note values in the ligatures, and sometimes the middle note can be a maxima. Now let's have a look at the way of writing, the way of connecting the notes. If the distance is very short, if the interval is only a second, we have to do it as follows. This way, ascending or descending. If it's a third, it's like this. The notes touching each other. So, or this way. But if the distance is longer than a third, then we need a connecting stroke. For example, this way. Or this way. And finally, we also have the angled way of writing. If we want to connect in one ligature those two notes, then we have to do it as follows. Then from this ligature, the left side is one note and the right side is one note. One could think that this is a sort of stem of the note, but it's not. If a note of the ligature needs a stem, it has to be written at the right side of the note, and when there is a falling note that's lower, then the stem of this note should be drawn lower than this note. So now this note has a stem, and if this note needs a stem, it's this way. And so we can give every note a stem. This way, so that's the stem of the middle note, and the final note can have a stem this way. Although this is nonsense, but we will see that later. Every note of the ligature can be dotted, and the dot can be written at the end of the note, after the note, but if there's no place, the dot will be written above the note. Also, at the angled note, the dot will be somewhere here and here. And of course, we can make a combination of the angled one and this one, for example, this way. And now the angled one, if it starts here, we can do it this way. And then it can go on again, etc. Of every ligature we can say there's a first note and a last note, an initial note and a final note. And if the ligature is longer than two notes, it has also middle notes. So first note, middle note, middle note, middle note, last note. And for those three categories, there are rules that are different if we want to talk about the length of the notes. And the rules for the middle notes are the easiest, so let's start with those. The middle note can be brevis, or longa, brevis, or maxima. Very common is the brevis, and actually it's not so complicated, you just write a brevis. And if the note should be a longa, we can make a longa of it. So for the middle note, it's just what you see. And it's the same with the maxima. has to be long, otherwise you don't see it. Now we have learned that the maxima has the stem at the right side, but in the ligature a stem is not necessary. You can see it sometimes, but normally you see it this way, that's the common way. And if it has a stem at the right side, it's also correct, but it's an exception to write it this way. Now the first and the last note, that's a little bit more complex. The rule is, if the first note is lower than the second one, then the first note is a brevis. If the first note is higher than the second one, then the first note is a longa. And for the last note we can say, if the last note is higher than the previous note, it's the brevis. And when the final note is lower than the previous note, it's a longa. So we can say if it's a group of two notes, if it's ascending, it's brevis, brevis, and then when it's descending, it's longa, longa. But now, if we want to have a longa instead of a brevis, we have just to make a longa of it. So this is ascending, is starting low, so it's brevis. Now we make a longa of it, so that's not so difficult to remember. You see here just a brevis and you see here a longa now. And also for the final note, if we want to make a longa, we just put a stem at the right side. So now it's longa, longa. The other way is not so very logic for us. Now it's descending, so this should be longa, longa. But if we want to make a brevis of it, we have to write a stem at the left side going downwards. And then it's the brevis. And for the last note, we have to write the stem upward. And then it's a brevis again. You have to start to learn by heart those first two groups. That's the starting point. Then it's not so complex, not so difficult to remember this one because you see longer. But this one you really have to learn. But actually this note, this way, the writing of the brevis, you see in practice, but not too often. Normally they do this, an angled group. And when it's angled, then the last note is not the longa, but is the brevis. It needs no stem. The first note is just following the rules we learned. So if it's high, it's the longa, and if you want to make a brevis of it, it's the brevis. So now you can see this and this is the same, but this one you see very often, and this one is not so common. And finally we have the cop. It doesn't matter if it's descending or ascending or if it's angled or whatever. If the stem is at the left side, upward, then the first and the second note is a semibrevis. So this group, which is together a brevis, is written this way. And this is the ligature you see very often in the 16th century, the whole 16th century you see this one very often. And the second half of the 16th century and around 1600, it's actually the only one you see. So actually that's all. If you learn those 5 groups, 6 groups, then you know everything. Now finally a repetition. We see here a long ligature, and just have a look and tell me what is the value of the notes. Well, I give the answer. The first note is higher than the second one, so it's the longa. This note is a middle note, should be a brevis, but it has the stem of the longa, so it's the longa. This note has no stem, it's only a connecting stroke, so we learned middle notes are brevis.